April 29, 1975, the Huey helicopter trembles as it lifts off from the roof of the American embassy in Saigon. Below, chaos erupts. Thousands of South Vietnamese citizens swarm the embassy gates, desperate to escape. Some scale the walls, others claw at the chain-link fences. A few manage to grab onto the landing skids of departing helicopters, only to fall away as the aircraft rise into the humid Vietnamese sky. Inside the helicopter, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Harrington stares down at the scene with an expression of profound emptiness. He's been in Vietnam for years. He's fought here. He's lost friends here. He's believed in the mission here. And now, as the last American military personnel evacuate the embassy, he's watching it all end in exactly the way military planners had sworn would never happen. The helicopter banks toward the sea, toward the waiting American fleet. Behind them, Saigon burns. Not literally, though fires do rage in several districts where North Vietnamese forces have begun their final assault. But metaphorically, spiritually, the city is burning. The capital of South Vietnam, the prize that American soldiers had died for, the nation that American military might have promised to defend, is collapsing. It's collapsing in hours, not weeks. In hours, not the months that military strategists had predicted. General Frederick Wyand sits in the Pentagon watching the evacuation unfold on television monitors. His jaw is clenched so tightly that his subordinates worry he might break his teeth. Wyand had been the last commander of American forces in Vietnam. He'd left the country just weeks earlier, convinced that the South Vietnamese army was capable of defending itself, that American military aid and training had been sufficient to hold the line against North Vietnam. He'd been catastrophically wrong. The North Vietnamese offensive, which military intelligence had predicted would take months to develop, had instead taken weeks. The South Vietnamese army, which American officers had trained and equipped and pronounced ready, had collapsed almost immediately. Entire divisions had surrendered or fled. Officers had abandoned their troops. The carefully constructed military machine that American advisors had built over more than a decade was disintegrating like a house of cards in a hurricane. Wyand watches the helicopter footage. He watches Americans and South Vietnamese scrambling onto aircraft. He watches the North Vietnamese flag being raised over government buildings. He watches the end of everything he'd worked for, everything American soldiers had died for, everything the military had promised would be achieved. General William Westmoreland, the architect of American military strategy in Vietnam for the first years of the war, is in his office at the Pentagon. He's been retired for years, but he's still a powerful voice in military circles. He's been watching the collapse of South Vietnam with growing horror and anger, not at the North Vietnamese, who are simply prosecuting their war, not at the South Vietnamese, who are fighting as best they can, but at the American political leadership, which Westmoreland believes has betrayed the military, betrayed the soldiers, betrayed the mission. Westmoreland had commanded over 500,000 American troops at the height of the war. He'd overseen the largest military commitment America had made since World War II. He'd promised that the war was being won, that light was visible at the end of the tunnel, that American military superiority would ultimately prevail. He'd been wrong. Catastrophically, publicly, humiliatingly wrong. The Tet Offensive of 1968 had shattered his credibility. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, hitting American bases, provincial capitals, even the American embassy in Saigon. The attacks had been repelled, militarily speaking. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had suffered enormous casualties, but politically the Tet Offensive had been a disaster for America. The American public, watching the fighting on television, had concluded that the war was being lost, not won. Westmoreland's credibility had been destroyed. He'd been reassigned. Eventually, he'd retired. But he'd never forgiven the American political leadership for what he saw as their betrayal. They'd prevented him from winning the war, he believed. They'd imposed restrictions on military operations. They'd refused to invade North Vietnam, to mine Hanoi Harbor, to pursue the war to its logical conclusion. If only they'd allowed the military to fight without political constraints, Westmoreland was convinced, America would have won. Now, watching South Vietnam collapse, Westmoreland is convinced his theory has been proven correct. The military had been right all along. The politicians had been wrong. And the cost of that political failure was about to be measured in the lives of millions of South Vietnamese who would face communist rule. Admiral Thomas Moorer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, sits in the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, watching the evacuation in real time. Moorer had been a hawk on Vietnam. He'd consistently advocated for more aggressive military action, for expanded bombing campaigns, for invasion of North Vietnam. He'd been overruled by political leadership repeatedly. Now he's watching the consequences of those political decisions unfold. The evacuation is proceeding in a controlled manner, as controlled as possible given the chaos. Helicopters are ferrying people from the embassy to the fleet. The last American military personnel will be gone within hours. The last American combat troops had left Vietnam in 1973, 2 years ago, but military advisors and support personnel had remained. Now even they are leaving. Moorer thinks back to 1965 when Operation Rolling Thunder began. The massive bombing campaign was supposed to break North Vietnam's will to fight. It didn't. For 3 years, American aircraft dropped more tonnage of bombs on North Vietnam than had been dropped on Japan during all of World War II. Entire cities were devastated. Entire regions were reduced to rubble. And still, North Vietnam fought on. Moorer had believed that if the bombing campaign had been allowed to continue, if it had been allowed to expand, if American forces had been allowed to invade North Vietnam, the war would have been won. But political leadership had decided that such escalation was too risky, that it might provoke Chinese intervention, that it might lead to nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Those risks had seemed real at the time. Now, watching South Vietnam collapse, Moorer wonders if the political leadership had been too cautious, too timid, too willing to accept constraints on military action. General Alexander Haig, who had served as a senior military advisor and would later become Secretary of State, watches the evacuation with a sense of profound betrayal. Haig had believed in the Vietnam War. He'd believed that American military power could defeat communism in Southeast Asia. He'd believed that the sacrifice of American soldiers was justified by the larger strategic goal of preventing communist expansion. Now that belief is being shattered in real time. The soldiers who had died in Vietnam, the 58,000 Americans who had been killed, the hundreds of thousands who had been wounded, the millions of Vietnamese civilians caught in the crossfire, all of that sacrifice was about to be rendered meaningless as South Vietnam fell to the north. Haig thinks about the soldiers he'd known who had died in Vietnam. He thinks about their families. He thinks about what he'll say to them when he encounters them in the future. How will he explain that their loved ones died for a cause that ultimately failed? How will he justify the sacrifice? In the White House, President Gerald Ford watches the evacuation with a mixture of resignation and frustration. Ford had become president only 8 months earlier, following Richard Nixon's resignation. He'd inherited the Vietnam War from his predecessor, a war that had already been winding down for years. He'd hoped to manage an orderly withdrawal, to maintain American credibility, to ensure that the fall of South Vietnam wouldn't damage American interests globally. But events had moved faster than anyone anticipated. The North Vietnamese had launched their final offensive in March. By late April, it was clear that South Vietnam couldn't be saved. Ford had authorized the evacuation. Now he's watching it unfold. Ford thinks about the promises that had been made to South Vietnam. American presidents had sworn to defend South Vietnam. American generals had promised that South Vietnamese forces could hold the line. American diplomats had assured South Vietnamese leaders that America would stand by them. All of those promises are being broken in real time as helicopters lift off from the embassy roof and American troops abandon the country they'd fought for. In Saigon itself, the atmosphere is one of apocalyptic chaos. The North Vietnamese army is closing in on the city. Tanks are rolling down the streets of the suburbs. The South Vietnamese government is dissolving. President Nguyen Van Thieu had fled the country days earlier, taking with him millions of dollars in cash and gold. The military leadership is in disarray. Officers are abandoning their troops. Soldiers are throwing away their weapons and uniforms, trying to blend into the civilian population. American military advisors, the last ones still in the country, are coordinating the evacuation. They're trying to get as many South Vietnamese as possible onto the helicopters. They're trying to prevent a complete massacre as North Vietnamese forces enter the city. They're trying to maintain some semblance of order and dignity as the American military presence in Vietnam comes to an end. One American officer, a lieutenant colonel who's been in Vietnam for multiple tours, stands on the embassy roof watching the helicopters depart. He's holding a folder containing classified documents that he's supposed to destroy. He watches the helicopters rise into the sky. He watches them bank toward the sea. He watches them disappear into the distance. He looks down at the folder in his hands. He thinks about burning it as regulations require. But instead he opens it and lets the documents flutter down from the roof, scattering across the embassy grounds below. It's a small act of rebellion, a small refusal to follow orders, a small gesture of defiance against a system that has failed so completely. He walks to the edge of the roof. Below, the city is in chaos. Gunfire echoes through the streets. Smoke rises from burning buildings. The North Vietnamese flag is being raised over government buildings. The American presence in Vietnam, which had lasted more than a decade, is coming to an end. The lieutenant colonel thinks about the soldiers he's known who have died in Vietnam. He thinks about the promises that were made to them. He thinks about the mission that was supposed to prevent communist expansion in Southeast Asia. He thinks about how that mission has failed so completely and so publicly. He turns away from the edge of the roof and walks toward the last helicopter waiting to evacuate the remaining American personnel. As he approaches, he sees the pilot giving him a thumbs-up signal. The helicopter is ready to depart. This will be the last flight. The lieutenant colonel climbs aboard. The helicopter door closes. The rotors begin to turn faster. The aircraft lifts off from the embassy roof. Below, the last American military personnel are being evacuated from Vietnam. In the Pentagon, General Wyand receives a report that the last American troops have left Vietnamese soil. He reads the report in silence. Around him, his staff is quiet. Nobody speaks. Nobody knows what to say. The war is over. America has lost. Wyand thinks back to his final assessment before he left Vietnam. He'd predicted that the South Vietnamese army could hold the line for at least a few months, possibly longer. He'd been catastrophically wrong. The army had collapsed in weeks. The country had fallen in days. He wonders what went wrong. Was it the training? No, the training had been thorough. Was it the equipment? No, the equipment had been state-of-the-art. Was it the strategy? Possibly. But more than anything, Wyand suspects it was the will to fight. The South Vietnamese leadership had lost faith in the cause. They'd believed, correctly as it turned out, that America was abandoning them. And when that belief took hold, the army had simply ceased to function as a cohesive military force. Wyand thinks about all the American advisors who had worked with the South Vietnamese army. They'd poured their hearts into the training mission. They'd believed that they were building a military force capable of defending itself. They'd been betrayed by circumstances beyond their control, by political decisions made in Washington, by the collapse of the South Vietnamese leadership. In his office, Admiral Moore receives the same report. He reads it, and then sits back in his chair, staring at the wall. The war is over. America has lost. The military's predictions about what would happen if America withdrew have been proven correct. South Vietnam has fallen to communism. The dominoes are toppling, just as military strategists had warned they would. But Moore takes no satisfaction in being right, because being right about the disaster means that the disaster has actually occurred. It means that American soldiers have died for nothing. It means that American military power, despite being vastly superior to North Vietnamese military power, has failed to achieve its objective. Moore thinks about the bombing campaign. He thinks about Operation Rolling Thunder. He thinks about all the tonnage of ordnance that had been dropped on North Vietnam. He thinks about the destruction that had been inflicted. And he thinks about how it had all been for nothing. The bombing hadn't broken North Vietnam's will to fight. The bombing hadn't prevented the North Vietnamese from ultimately conquering South Vietnam. Moore wonders what would have happened if the military had been allowed to prosecute the war without political constraints. Would a full-scale invasion of North Vietnam have changed the outcome? Would expanded bombing campaigns have been decisive? Would allowing the military to fight the war the way it wanted to fight it have resulted in an American victory? He'll never know. The political leadership had decided to constrain military operations, and now the war was lost. Moore can only wonder about what might have been. In his retirement, General Westmoreland is giving interviews to journalists about the fall of Vietnam. He's consistent in his message. The military was right. The politicians were wrong. If only the political leadership had allowed the military to fight the war without constraints. If only they'd been willing to invade North Vietnam. If only they'd been willing to expand the bombing campaign, America would have won. Westmoreland believes this with absolute conviction. He's not interested in examining the possibility that the war might have been unwinnable regardless of military strategy. He's not interested in the possibility that the South Vietnamese government was too corrupt, too ineffective, too lacking in popular support to be saved by American military power alone. He's committed to the narrative that the military was right and the politicians were wrong. This narrative will dominate American military thinking for decades. It will influence military strategy in future conflicts. It will shape how the military views civilian political leadership, and it will create a deep rift between the military and civilian leadership that will take years to heal. In the White House, President Ford is already thinking about how to manage the political fallout from the fall of Vietnam. He knows that there will be recriminations. He knows that there will be investigations. He knows that there will be attempts to assign blame for the failure. Ford decides that the best approach is to move forward, to not dwell on the past, to focus on America's future, rather than its recent failures. He'll give speeches about American resilience. He'll talk about how America must learn from Vietnam and do better in the future. He'll try to restore American confidence and credibility in the world. But privately, Ford knows that something fundamental has changed. American military power, which had seemed invincible after World War II, has been proven to have limits. American military technology, which had seemed so advanced, has been unable to defeat a less technologically advanced enemy. American military strategy, which had seemed so carefully thought out, has failed to achieve its objectives. The fall of Vietnam will haunt American foreign policy for years to come. Every military intervention will be haunted by the specter of Vietnam. Every military strategy will be questioned in light of Vietnam. Every military leader will have to prove that they've learned the lessons of Vietnam. But what are those lessons? That's the question that will divide American military and political leadership for decades. Some will say the lesson is that America must be willing to use overwhelming military force, that constraints on military operations are counterproductive, that the military must be allowed to fight wars the way it wants to fight them. Others will say the lesson is that military power alone cannot solve political problems, that nation building is extraordinarily difficult, that American military power has limits. These two interpretations of Vietnam will shape American foreign policy for decades. They'll lead to heated debates about military interventions. They'll influence decisions about where America should intervene militarily and where it should not. They'll create a deep divide between those who believe America should use military force more aggressively and those who believe America should be more cautious about military interventions. But all of that debate lies in the future. In the immediate aftermath of the fall of Vietnam, American military and political leadership is simply trying to process what has happened. How did the most powerful military force on Earth fail to prevent a small, poor, technologically backward country from conquering its neighbor? How did American military power, which had seemed so overwhelming, prove so ineffective? General Wyand, watching the last helicopters lift off from Saigon, thinks about these questions. He thinks about the soldiers who had died under his command. He thinks about the promises that had been made to them. He thinks about the mission that had failed so completely. He wonders if there was anything that could have been done differently. He wonders if the war was unwinnable from the start. He wonders if American military power, no matter how overwhelming, could have prevented South Vietnam from falling to the north. But mostly he feels a profound sense of failure. He'd been the commander. He'd been responsible. And the mission had failed on his watch. In the Pentagon, Admiral Moore is already beginning to draft reports about what went wrong. He's analyzing the military situation. He's examining the decisions that were made. He's trying to understand how the war was lost. But Moore knows that the real reasons for the failure go beyond military strategy. They're political. They're cultural. They're about the will of the South Vietnamese people to resist communist rule. They're about the effectiveness of the South Vietnamese government. They're about whether the South Vietnamese people believed that their government was worth fighting for. On all of these counts, the answer had been no. The South Vietnamese government was corrupt. The South Vietnamese people didn't believe in it. The South Vietnamese army, lacking motivation, lacking faith in their leadership, lacking belief in the cause they were fighting for, had simply collapsed when the North Vietnamese applied pressure. American military power couldn't overcome these political and cultural factors. American military training couldn't create motivation where none existed. American military equipment couldn't substitute for a lack of will to fight. These are the real lessons of Vietnam. But they're not the lessons that most American military leaders want to learn. Most of them prefer to believe that the war was lost because of political constraints on military operations, not because of deeper political and cultural factors that were beyond military control. This misunderstanding of the lessons of Vietnam will have profound consequences. It will lead to military overconfidence in future conflicts. It will lead to failures in Iraq and Afghanistan. It will lead to repeated cycles of military intervention followed by military failure. But all of that lies in the future. In April 1975, American military leadership is simply trying to process the immediate reality. The war is over, America is lost, and the last American troops have left Vietnam. In Saigon, the city falls to the North Vietnamese within hours of the last American helicopter departing. North Vietnamese tanks roll through the streets. The North Vietnamese flag is raised over the presidential palace. The war is over. South Vietnam has ceased to exist as an independent nation. The fall of Saigon is watched around the world. In Moscow and Beijing, communist leaders celebrate. In Western capitals, Allied leaders are shaken by the speed and completeness of the American failure. In America itself, the public is shocked and demoralized by the images of chaos and defeat. American soldiers who had fought in Vietnam are watching the fall of their country from their homes. Many of them are experiencing something like grief. They've sacrificed years of their lives. Many of them have been wounded. Some of them have lost friends and comrades. And now they're watching the country they fought for fall to the enemy they fought against. Some of them are angry. They believe, as Westmoreland does, that the war could have been won if only the politicians had allowed the military to fight without constraints. Others are confused, trying to understand what went wrong. Still others are simply devastated, struggling to process the loss. For American military leadership, the fall of Vietnam represents a fundamental challenge to their understanding of American military power and American military strategy. For decades, American military leaders had believed that American military technology and American military training could overcome any enemy. Vietnam has proven that belief wrong. The question now is whether American military leadership will learn the right lessons from Vietnam. Will they understand that military power alone cannot solve political problems? Will they understand that nation-building is extraordinarily difficult? Will they understand that the will of the local population to fight for their government is crucial to military success? Or will they cling to the belief that the war was lost because of political constraints, that the military could have won if only it had been allowed to fight without limitations? The answer to these questions will shape American foreign policy for decades to come. In the Pentagon, General Wyand receives a final report. The last American military personnel have left Vietnam. The evacuation is complete. The war is over. Wyand reads the report and then sits back in his chair. He thinks about all the American soldiers who had died in Vietnam. He thinks about the 58,000 Americans who had been killed. He thinks about the hundreds of thousands who had been wounded. He thinks about the millions of Vietnamese civilians who had died in the crossfire. He thinks about the promises that had been made to the South Vietnamese. He thinks about the American commitment to defend South Vietnam. He thinks about how that commitment has been abandoned as the last American troops leave the country. Wyand thinks about what he'll tell people in the future when they ask him about Vietnam. How will he explain the failure? How will he justify the sacrifice? How will he defend the decisions that were made? He doesn't have good answers to these questions. He only knows that something has gone terribly wrong. He only knows that American military power, which had seemed so overwhelming, has failed to achieve its objective. He only knows that the war is over, America has lost, and the last American troops have left Vietnam. The helicopter carrying the last American military personnel from Saigon banks out over the South China Sea. Below, the city is burning. Behind them, North Vietnamese forces are consolidating their control. The war that had consumed American attention for more than a decade is finally over. The pilot of the helicopter looks back at Saigon one last time. He thinks about the soldiers he's known who have died here. He thinks about the missions he's flown. He thinks about the war he's fought. And he thinks about how it's all ending in defeat and chaos. He turns his attention back to the instruments. The helicopter is heading toward the American fleet waiting offshore. Soon, the last American military personnel will be aboard American ships, heading back to America. The American military presence in Vietnam will be nothing but a memory, but it will be a memory that haunts American military and political leadership for decades to come. It will be a memory that shapes American foreign policy. It will be a memory that influences every military decision that America makes in the future. The fall of Vietnam represents a fundamental turning point in American history. It marks the end of American military invincibility. It marks the beginning of American doubt about its military power and its military strategy. It marks the start of a long period of American recrimination and self-examination about the nature of military power and the limits of military solutions to political problems. But all of that lies in the future. In the present moment, as the last American helicopter disappears into the distance, carrying the last American military personnel away from Vietnam, what remains is a sense of profound failure and loss. The war is over. America has lost. And the consequences of that loss will reverberate through American history for generations to come.